It is a delight to welcome back to 100 Huntley Street Gary Bates, a creationist, someone who is speaking with great authority and has for decades now, between 3 and 4 decades of making the compelling case that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He heads up Creation Ministries International. He is a member, he and his wife Frances, of Eastside Baptist Church, our partner ministry here in the United States that allows us to house 100 Huntley Street when we are here in the U.S. Gary, it's good to have you here.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
This is a place that you're familiar worshiping.
Yeah, been here quite a few years now, and church has been very, very supportive of CMI.
Well, you know, I am so grateful to get to know you, and we go back as far as we being Huntley Street with you to a number of years. You were on with my buddy Jim Canelon talking about UFOs a few years ago. You are in and out of Canada quite a bit.
Yeah.
Australian
Yep.
in origin. How long in the United States?
We've been here almost 6.5 years now. Yeah, came here in 2009 to head up the U.S. office.
And let's go back and talk for a moment. We're going to spend some time here, a little biographical, then we're going to talk bigger
Sure.
issues. But let's go back. Did you come to know Christ in Australia? Did you grow up in a Christian family, secular family? What was your story?
Yeah, well, look, my story, I think, is typical, similar to most people my generation, even younger today. When I went to school in those days, we were allowed to sing hymns in morning assembly and say prayers. But the big disconnect I had is I'd go off to my biology classes or my geology classes, and I was taught we were evolved apes. And then I'd go to my scripture classes, and I'd say to the reverend who was teaching us, Genesis says that we were made in the image of God. But in my biology classes, and they'd say things like, well, you've got to understand Genesis is poetry, or there's an evolutionary process or a scientific process behind it. But, even as a teenager, I wasn't a rocket scientist, and it doesn't take one to work out that the two ideas are really incompatible.
So you were in conflict even as a kid.
Absolutely.
Did that lead to a pursuit of faith or pursuit of atheism?
I'd say agnosticism for many years. And then ultimately, as a young father with 2 children, I was still wrestling with this concept of whether there's a God. And when I looked at all the injustices of the world, in fact, I can go back to those Ethiopian famines in Africa. Do you remember those? Mm-hmm. When we were having Live Aid concerts around the world to raise money. Now, what I'm about to tell you, let me just preface this. I'm ashamed that I used to think like this, but I want to make the point that it was consistent with what I was developing, which was an atheistic view of the world.
Okay.
I would look at those concerts, and they were very nice, and everyone had the warm and fuzzies about it. And I'd look at those terrible pictures of starving children, skin and bone. And I would say, if there's a God, why did he allow that to happen? And then I would say, well, there obviously is no God. So if we're going to be consistent with an evolutionary belief, they're obviously overpopulating, the land can't support them. What's the point of raising all this money? We're going to have the same problem again. And I believe that natural selection was a mechanism to cull the weak. Let's reduce the population and restore the balance. Let's allow nature to take over. Now, contrast that with a Christian worldview, which obviously I have now, is why would we go and feed the hungry in Africa? Well, we go back to creation, and Jesus indicates, or the Creator indicates that we're made in His image. And in Romans it tells us that from one blood, from one man, He made all nations of men. But you see, Darwin had this idea that the so-called black races were less evolved, were more primitive, lower on the evolutionary scale. Modern science has caught up and now shows that all humanity, is closely related, less than 1%, and all the differences in humanity. We now know genetically you can fit all the diversity of human populations within an original human couple. So, you see, this is one of the problems when you talk about a disconnect. That then led me to say, you know what, as I said, there is no God. And from that, it's interesting, once I made that decision, things started to happen. Friends around me started to get saved. They wanted to witness to me. I avoided them. But ultimately I said, you know what, I'm confident in my evolutionary beliefs.
And the evolutionary beliefs led to their logical or illogical conclusion is pretty hopeless and pretty cynical.
Yeah, I said that their faith was based upon a kind of a feel-good experience. There was no rational basis for it. Science, rules. We pick up fossils. I was told they were millions of years old. It supports that particular view. Now, that's what most people believe. And that's what we're taught. The reason I believe that is because public education taught me that. And even as Christians, John, the majority of people today, families, parents, their children in countries, Western countries around the world, are being taught one view of origins.
Mm-hmm.
And quite simply, if I only present to you one view of a story or a situation, it's kind of like a half-truth. I'm only giving you enough information to convince you as to that one side of the story.
That's a great point.
And what I've done, I've been doing this for 25 years now, and CMI, we employ more scientists, more PhDs than any Christian ministry in the world. I mean, to the best of my knowledge anyway. And I have to tell you that right now is the most exciting time ever to be a Bible-believing creationist. We don't have to compromise. We don't have to come up with, theological machinations in Genesis to try to say the days were millions of years and so on and so forth. There are so many areas that we can look at now where we can actually directly falsify the theory of evolution based upon their own assumptions. If I could just give you an example.
Please.
Dinosaurs. One of the most asked questions we get when we go out on ministry. I mean, dinosaurs typically are the poster child for evolution. Right? Hear the word dinosaurs, millions of years. And I've had Christians say, well, dinosaurs didn't really exist. Maybe Satan created their fossils in the rocks to confuse people.
Yeah.
So a few examples. Right now we are finding, and when I say we, I don't mean creationists, but we're doing that as well, but secular scientists, evolutionists, looking at fossils are finding soft tissue, unfossilized red blood cells, even unfossilized DNA in dinosaur fossils and bones that supposedly died out a minimum of 65 million years ago. Impossible. Our DNA is basically a chemical molecule, degrades very, very quickly. And when we try to, analyze these and give them the benefit of the doubt and say, what's the maximum age, even under the perfect conditions that you could freeze or keep DNA, we're talking about a maximum of 40,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yet according to evolutionists, the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago.
Yet the DNA is still fresh enough, real enough, that you're able to say this could be in a window of 40,000 years.
Yeah, we're not saying it is 40,000 years, but we're saying that's the absolute maximum. Mm-hmm. We find carbon-14 in coal that's supposed to be 350 million years old. We find carbon-14 in diamonds that's supposed to be billions of years old. And just to explain that, carbon-14 as a radiometric dating method is not used to date things millions of years. It's got a very short half-life, and the maximum age of carbon-14 existing in anything that once died, has to be in organic material, is around about 60,000 years. After that, it becomes undetectable. So when you find carbon-14 in diamonds that's supposed to be billions of years old, they're the hardest substance known to man. It's impossible for them to be contaminated by outside sources. So again, it directly falsifies that evolutionary paradigm, because rocks and fossils are the reason that evolutionists believe the Earth is billions of years old. But when we look at their claims, we look at their alleged evidences, we can find carbon-14 in it that falsifies that view, for example.
So fossils, carbon dating, some of the foundation through the years is beginning to crumble. Tell us the journey of your conversion, and then we'll get a little bit more into the world of creation science.
I'd always had this view that Jesus was, a good guy of his day, and that we looked back in history and we took him out of context. That the Jews were looking for a Messiah. He was a good candidate. Yeah, he self-sacrificed. But I tell you, as I read the Gospels, and the one thing about John, he's a black and white guy, light and dark, black and white. I kind of like that. And, I can narrow my salvation down to 3 words. And those words are in the Gospel of John when Christ is on the cross and he says, "It is finished." And that hit me right between the eyes. I was lying in bed, I can still picture it, a little side lamp table and my wife's fast asleep. It is finished. And I thought, some guy hanging up there by mistake wouldn't say things like that, being nailed in his feet and his hands and about to be speared.
Yeah, that's not the statement the average man, even extraordinary man, would make.
Exactly not. And then I thought, well, I tried to explain it away. He did it for his people, for the Jews of the day. And then I thought, well, hang on, my friends who've been witnessing to me, they're Christians. So somehow he did it for them also, for our generation. Now, I've got to preface this by saying I'm not a God told me type of guy, okay? And I mean, I'm sure you've met many people who come up to you and say that. But this was still to this day the most powerful encounter I've ever had with God, is I heard these words, I did it for you. And they struck me so hard, and I can't say to you whether I heard them audibly or whether just in my spirit. I even looked around in the room.
That real.
And I literally started to shake. It was that real to me. And in the morning, I woke up and I said to my wife, I need to become a Christian. That's how it happened. That was my conversion experience. It happened to me it was a process, but literally reading the Gospel of John.
I'm glad that we had some conversation here. Thank you. Gary Bates goes all over the world and lectures. He has a incredible team, and every year globally they are out there sharing in lectures and smaller groups, large gatherings, debates. They're out there in the arena. And I want to encourage you to pray for the folks at CMI. Pray for Gary, that God would give him wisdom and that they would have the resources they need. And I hope that you'll visit their website, you'll find out more, and perhaps you are a pastor, or you're a civic leader, or you're someone as a person of influence, and you'd like to engage the organization to come to your community, to your entity. Why don't you give them a call or send them an email and find out how that's done? Gary, thanks so very, very much. God bless you.